There we go. Presenting these slides on behalf of Nicole Hannes at Berkeley Lab. But thankfully, she developed a very detailed script when she presented this before. So you're going to get the same experience, just a different voice. But would still love questions, and we can collaboratively try to make sure we answer them. And then if we need to follow up with Nicole, we can. All right. So first, I'm going to quickly mention some of the additional resources on this topic of mitigation strategies and best practices for restoration. And I was actually part of this project that Berkeley Lab is creating for the Grid Deployment Office that just lays out a lot of the resilience measures and technologies. And there's going to be fact sheets available on the GDO website in the coming months. So we'll talk about that, and then I'll do an overview of multiple strategies ranging from vegetation management to grid modernization techniques. And I'll conclude with 3 case studies showing how some of these strategies have actually been implemented. So here is a look at resources from the Grid Deployment Office. Berkeley Lab put together in-depth case studies of how different utilities have valued and prioritized different portfolios of resilience projects. So this is Pete's team. They looked at the Con Ed substation, which he just covered, undergrounding distribution lines in Florida, and a major microgrid project that took place over several years for San Diego Gas and Electric. So those are 3 case studies that are going to be available, and then the project that I contributed to as well was 2-pagers on 10 different resilience strategies that you see there, undergrounding, pole investments, etc. And that just really gets into the details of these different technologies, so state energy offices can pick up and learn more about how these different technologies work and roughly like what the cost range is. And so we'll talk about that as well, but then similar material will ultimately be available on the GDO website. And these strategies that you see listed here align with the categories of the IIJA bill. We tried to make sure that to have that consistency, so if there's certain measures that are eligible in IIJA, you can map them directly to this list here and then have those fact sheets available. All right. Before we start, I want to say that the end of this deck has roughly 50 references ranging from academic papers and research reports to utility filings and industry white papers to give you a deeper dive into how these technologies are being implemented. So there's a lot of content in this presentation, detailed slides that we won't have time to get into, but then there'll be a lot of references towards the end. And there's a lot of up-to-date references as well. And even for technologies that have been around for a while, like undergrounding, there's continuing to be research about how much it might cost for different types of scenarios. Okay, so I'm going to go through 5 main categories of strategies today. We have vegetation management, hardening, customer-focused strategies, redundancy and backup, and grid modernization technologies. Everyone should have access to these slides, so I don't want to spend too much time going into details. This is just mostly meant to be a high-level reference for general descriptions, pros, cons, and costs. So you can refer to this later if you're starting to explore these different technologies. The hardening category is a broad category that includes undergrounding and wires investments, and that's something that Pete went into detail on about the substation hardening project in New York. And then the next is customer-focused strategies. It is also a broad category, and you can think of it today as a discussion on distributed energy resources. So that's the customer-focused strategies there. And then finally, the table here is really focused on the perspective of resilience. How did these strategy buckets advance grid resilience, and what is their relative cost? Therefore, some strategies like DERs may have high costs, but one should consider all of the other non-resilience reasons that may drive a consumer or a utility to adopt DERs. So, there'll be non-resilience benefits and to consider as well, but this is focused on resilience. All right. So I think there's been a lot of discussion about vegetation management, so we're not going to get into a lot of detail here. But just at a high level, vegetation management prevents against trees and brush falling onto lines and poles from severe storms, namely high winds as well as icing. And it also prevents against wildfires, both from sagging in the lines due to extreme heat and high loads, igniting nearby trees, and also from trees already on fire, taking down lines and poles. I'll mention now that I'm going to be giving a cost range on most of these strategies today, and with all of them there will be references. So you can see here cost range, and then you can see these references that refer to the specific references at the end of the deck. Most of the cost estimates are taken directly from utility filings, but some are also taken from white papers or journal articles if they aren't yet standard practice. These strategies should be covered under IIJ funds, but there's also just like basic vegetation management, right? Like you don't want to use IIJ funds to fund just basic vegetation management activities. It's got to be some sort of enhanced or better approach that's going to improve resilience, because it's better use of taxpayer funds for IIJ as well as the customer funds for the part that's going to be covered by ratepayers. And the cost ranges here come from utility proceedings including Florida, Texas, and Baltimore. And it's a pretty wide range because there's distribution, there's transmission, there's rural, there's urban, and so there's a lot of variation. So now we'll take a look at hardening, but Pete actually covered that in his case study in detail. So yeah, we're actually going to go into undergrounding, which is a big topic right now. With undergrounding, the main advantage is that you're protecting your equipment from natural threats that occur above ground. So that would be high winds, icing, and wildfires mainly. On average, a 10% increase in a system's underground miles is shown to reduce annual interruption duration by about as much time. However, there still are some disadvantages that one should be aware of, including the fact that underground lines can be harder to repair. And in some cases, if the line is underground, it might be hard to even identify where an outage is occurring. So that could potentially increase restoration times in certain situations. And research is starting to show that underground lines have shorter overall lifetimes, maybe even half the lifetime as overhead lines. It's unclear exactly what that number is, but they're starting to see that the undergrounding does have an impact on the lifetime of the line. And then you may also be exposing your system to other threats by putting them underground, such as flooding, especially in areas at risk of sea level rise. So the cost here is very wide. Again, we have the differences in undergrounding transmission versus distribution. It's going to be a big cost difference there. But if it's urban versus rural, in more urban environments, it's just a lot more costly to do the work and deal with other infrastructure that's in place. And let's see here. Yeah, okay. So yeah, rural areas are generally less cost, but then if it's like some very remote or difficult terrain, obviously that would increase the cost. So these are pretty wide ranges, and there's some references there, and it's just something to keep in mind. These examples of costs are pulled from California, Virginia Electric and Power Company, and the Wisconsin Public Service Corporation. Now we'll look at utility pole investments. There are two main categories of measures: improving inspection practices and or increasing inspection frequency, and of course converting wood poles to non-wood materials. If you do convert wood poles, you should be aware that they are overall harder to climb and are also more conductive, making them more dangerous to work on for line workers. So just a downside to consider there. Also, non-wood poles are heavier, making them more difficult to transfer and thus more expensive to install and replace. The costs posted here are differentials, meaning comparing wood and non-wood material poles. So that's what this is referring to here. It's that differential. And then we found these costs in proceedings for DTE, for the transmission numbers, and Duke and Xcel Energy for the distribution numbers there. Wires investments tend to focus on taking steps to prevent the wires from sagging and or tripping, and as with poles, improving or increasing inspections and maintenance. To prevent sagging and accidental contact with other conductors and grounded objects, one can insulate wires or install spacer cables. So here's an example of one of those. And to improve inspection practices, there are infrared assessments, corona scanning, and other high-definition imagery that can detect defects better than the naked eye. Compared to other resilience investments, wire insulation can be costly, so make sure to also consider strategies like undergrounding, which may be more effective at preventing outages. Of course, undergrounding is very expensive too, but if insulation is similarly expensive or it's just a huge investment, you might want to consider going all the way and just undergrounding the line if that's going to really mitigate the particularly like risks associated with high winds and icing. And this cost range here comes from utilities in California, PacifiCorp in the Pacific Northwest, and Liberty in Colorado. All right, so next up is customer-focused strategies, which is effectively distributed energy resources. This can cover a wide range of options from utility scale renewable installation of microgrids to household level strategies like solar and storage. This category also has a wide range of costs, but it is an example of where you want to consider other real benefits these systems can provide to customers. So if you just look at the utilities costs and the utility benefits or the system benefits, it's not going to capture all of the potential customer side benefits as well. And that includes improved reliability for that customer, reduced customer bills, and renewable energy installations in a neighborhood can help those folks feel part of the energy transition, increase energy education, and have local economy benefits. Was there a hand raised? I thought I saw a hand raised out of the corner of my eye. No? Okay. Our microgrid and resilience hub costs come from the cities of Baltimore and Austin, ComEd, and SDG&E. So a lot of different options and costs in this category. And then the solar and solar plus storage costs come from the Tracking the Sun report, and the EVs and thermostats are basically the market rates for those. All right, another customer-focused set of strategies is customer-level energy efficiency and grid interactive building design. So this table is adapted from DOE's Better Buildings Initiative resilience website. It compares what you can get from standard energy efficiency practices with what you can get with energy efficiency along with on-site generation and storage. I'll simply point out a couple of things here related to how these measures benefit customers during an outage. First, energy efficiency increases the passive survivability of a building, and this is the ability of a building to remain habitable, whether it's very cold or warm, outside during an outage from improved insulation or windows. So that's an important benefit to consider, is that passive survivability in the case of a more extended outage in particular. Next, if you introduce on-site generation and storage and configure it correctly, you can also continue energy services within your building, perhaps a limited set of emergency loads during a major grid disruption. And so that is related to our next category here, which is redundancy and backup. Most of the measures listed here are for utilities to consider at the transmission or distribution level. At the transmission level, this is really about ensuring your ability to continue to generate and deliver electricity. Usually this boils down to ensuring fuel supply, either in the form of secure on-site storage or by means of having redundant fuel supply chains. At the distribution level, there are similar measures around securing generation, but one can also consider the opportunities for grouping or islanding end users. and configuring the grid so that you can redistribute flow if part of the grid is down or provide a local generation. All right. Hopefully I don't get the order mixed up here. I think we're good. Grid modernization technologies is the last category, and this is a very broad and growing category. Two of the three utility case studies that I'll cover today are focused on grid mod technologies, so I won't spend too long here on definitions. Essentially, this category includes hardware and software options of varying degrees to help monitor, control, and optimize distribution grids and distributed energy resources. For the most part, these technologies are advancements of technologies that utilities have experience with for many years, but the cost can add up for comprehensive plans that include upgrades to foundational technologies. However, it is important to note that these costs do not include any co-development activities that utilities may require to realize the full benefits of the technology, particularly for the DER management systems. A lot of utilities like PG&E, my utility actually, is doing like co-development with Schneider and other DERMS providers, and that's a significant effort and cost by the utility that isn't necessarily included just in the software cost. All right, next we're going to discuss 3 utility case studies to get an idea of how utilities across the U.S. are improving their grid hardening practices and implementing various grid modernization technologies. So we'll start with Florida Power and Light here. After Hurricanes Matthew and Irma, the state of Florida began requiring utilities to put together storm protection plans. So I know Pete described that earlier in his presentation. I also talked about the requirements in Florida. They basically wanted utilities to produce these plans every 3 years, and they had to include steps they were going to take to protect all of their transmission and distribution facilities. In the 2023 Storm Protection Plan, FPL includes a description of several strategies they are taking or continuing to take. And today I'm going to go over their inspection and hardening programs. The reason I want to include inspection as a means of hardening is because the idea is for the utility to get as much useful life out of their existing infrastructure and to provide their preventative care steps. Basically, FPL increased their frequency of inspections for their distribution and transmission equipment, and also took extra steps like excavation to identify any early rotting. The tables depicted on the right are the improvements FPL saw from implementing their inspection programs for distribution on the top and transmission on the bottom. So you can see these improvements here that they saw. And given that these plans have been around a little bit longer and they've had several iterations, it's nice when they can kind of show that backward look of the improvements that they saw for different category of storms. But as I mentioned earlier, you have a category 3 storm versus a 4, it's not really an apples to apples comparison. So it's something always to consider. And they saw dramatic improvements both on the distribution and the transmission side from these investments. As for their other distribution feeder and lateral hardening strategies, they developed an extreme wind speed map to identify high-risk areas. So you can see here these different wind ratings, and you can see the areas that experience extremely high winds, and then areas that are a little bit less, and then the green areas there. So wind damage is really the biggest issue for Florida compared to any other natural threat. Among other hardening measures they took to undergrounding their distribution system in the high wind regions and learned some lessons along the way. First, they learned to use radar and directional boring to reduce the construction duration and overall disruption to communities. They also learned to host community meetings to increase awareness about what they were doing and to address concerns of nearby residents. I was wondering why there was a white area there. I think that's Duke Energy. So I guess they didn't, kind of ignored that area, but hopefully Duke has similar similar data. All right, so the main goal of their transmission hardening program was to convert wood structures to non-wood, so mainly steel or concrete. And with this, they've found a significant reduction in the percent of line section outages and structure failures during hurricanes. So again, you can see this backward-looking, comparison of different storms to show the benefits of the technologies. All right, next we're going to consider a different part of the country, Michigan, which also experiences severe storms and a lot of ice storms as well, of course. Since 2017, the Michigan Public Service Commission has required regulated utilities to develop distribution investment plans every 2 years, more frequent than in Florida. That was the Michigan plans that I was referring to in my prior presentation. Do we have anyone from Michigan here? Yeah, we do. Okay, cool. Therefore, Consumers Energy is on its third iteration, and they just released it 6 months ago. They have detailed several projects they're implementing in the next few years, including forestry line clearing, repairing and replacing distribution assets, undergrounding lines, and automating and digitizing their restoration services and clearing operations. We're also going to talk about their grid modernization efforts. All right, let's take a look at grid mod. All right. So they have plans to integrate a lot of their existing technologies and continue to improve them, so that could include line sensors, automatic transfer reclosers or ATRs, and advanced distribution management systems or ADMS. The plan also involved adding fault location isolation and service restoration, or FLISR, to automatically restore power to customers without operators or crews by detecting a fault in the system and operating switches and reclosers to isolate the fault and transfer customers to a different circuit. This is an example of an incremental approach where the utility has installed these individual software hardware systems over many years. So it takes a lot of planning to get all these systems to work together, both the hardware and the software. It can be pretty complex, and a lot of foundational investments in sensors and other hardware on the system. And they have a forward-looking plan for investments that they anticipate will incrementally reduce the duration of their outages. So yeah, there's a lot of acronyms on this slide, so if we need to go back to it, anyone has any questions, feel free to mention that later. One of the interesting things about this plan, though, is this came up earlier about metrics, right? And so what they did is actually say, for this resilient grid plan, which is like this entire portfolio of a huge amount of investments, what is their projections of SAIDI with the plan, and what they're saying, the current rate case levels, I believe. And what I thought was interesting about this is this is going out the next 10 years after the plan, or 10 years, I believe, yeah, 9 maybe. And they're saying, okay, if we make these investments, they're making some pretty bold claims that no single outage will affect more than 100,000 customers, and no customer will be without power for more than 24 hours following an outage. So that's I thought it was a pretty interesting example where, yes, they are asking for a lot of money, but they're also putting themselves on the hook to deliver on some pretty bold claims, both for the overall reduction, and then these, I was very surprised to see that they were committing to that, but maybe it's because they're asking for a lot of money. You have any thoughts on that? I was just curious.
So yeah, I reviewed their plan, obviously, but honestly, I don't know where that came from.
Huh.
Delivering points, I'm not sure if that was brought on by, because I'm fairly new kind of role right now, but I kind of thought the same thing.
Yeah.
That point
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was in their most recent version of their September plan. Yeah. But it's kind of getting back to what I was talking about earlier, where you can project out these metrics under different investment scenarios, and that can be a good way to really understand like what level of performance you're going to expect going forward.
If I may, just, yeah, our commissioners have, in the orders, really pushed to,
Mm.
lower studies and investments to try
Yeah,
to,
yeah, yeah, exactly. And when you forecast it, you got benchmark you can compare them to. So, all right. Next up, we'll get into National Grid's grid modernization investments in Massachusetts. So that in 2022, Massachusetts enacted their own Climate Act, which set statewide 2050 goals that were effectively asking utilities to connect more storage, renewable energy, and dramatically increase electrification. Therefore, the state wanted to see that the utilities had electric sector modernization plans, and 6 months ago, National Grid put together this future grid plan. Similar to Consumers Energy, National Grid is proposing a phased approach over the next several years to leverage their existing ADMS and DERMS hardware and software programs. This will better enable and optimize their distributed energy resources and other customer level measures like electrification and demand response. So yeah, I think one key thing to take away in a lot of these plans though is it's very complex. Hardware, software, customers, all of these things coming together. And as Paul has pointed out a couple times, there's a lot of value for distributed energy resources and microgrids, but it's all got to work together. And if these things are just kind of being controlled and operated in isolation and not working in concert with the system, it can create a lot of issues. So yeah, a lot of these plans get into very detailed roadmaps for those technologies, both for resilience and distribution system plans more broadly. I know you all talked a lot about that yesterday, so I'm not going to get into more detail there, but if there's any questions, please ask away, and hopefully we can answer them.